Okay.
Okay, so my name is Franz Schubert. I'm going to briefly just kind of discuss two periods of music. One is the classical period and another one is the romantic period. I'm going to use two composers such as Franz Schubert and Beethoven. Franz Schubert was born 1797 and died 1828. Beethoven, or Ludwig van Beethoven, was born 1770, 1827. Notice how 1828 and 1827 is closely related. So these are closely related composers, I would say. Now, with that being said, so if we take Franz Schubert, for example, we want to do classical period. So pretty much, this is all going to fall into the bracket of classical, romantic. So you have early, you have middle, and you'll have, the end of it, basically, though. So we want to kind of probably stick with more so kind of the end of the classical period. And so what I'm going to basically talk about is the classical period really indicates the Great Enlightenment era. So a lot of intellectuals, pretty much a way of life of living. And this is kind of how things were established, so not just with the community, but also even with the music, which is what these are some of the most elements of classical period, which is basically kind of establishing a point, kind of developing or kind of going astray from another point, and then reestablishing, where you are basically though. So pretty much in the classical form or music form, we have sonata form, which is exposition, development, and then return. This is also a same concept that can be also applied to the way of living for classical people during that time. With that being said, notice how the classical period also steers from also the Great Enlightenment. So people kind of getting into, like I said, kind of getting into oneself. So I'm going to talk about Schubert and talk about Beethoven, and I'm going to kind of talk about one era going to another era. So the Great Enlightenment is where we are right now, basically, though. This is in the middle because we're going to tie the pieces together. So there's a piece by Franz Schubert called the Erlking, and the Erlking is probably one of his later pieces that he composed. With that being said, the Erlking indicates how one period goes in from another, but not only goes into another, it actually swallows up the period and kind of now takes itself and lives itself as a romantic period, as it shall be. So there is a part of the actual piece where it's actually towards the end, and it's a chord that's kind of nebulous a little bit, and then Schubert ends with this final cadence. Basically, when that is done, the spirit basically, he kind of swallows up the boy, basically, because that's kind of how the premise of the story is. He swallows him up. But now, if we relate this back to these two periods, it's kind of the classical period being swallowed up by the romantic period, and now, basically, this is now taken over. So the romantic period indicates fantasy and folklore and nature, imagery, very imaginative. Because remember, it's not the same as the establishing, development, and then return, basically, though. It's kind of doing any and everything that it wants to do because it's in its own separate category of its own period. So I wanted to use this as a way of being able to bridge one gap, one era to another era. And after the Romanticism period, you go into the 20th century, but staying with the Romanticism period, it kind of has its own period on its own. So in conclusion, the Great Enlightenment kind of used both the classical and elements of the Romantic period as a way of being able to fulfill more oneself than anything. And these two composers was very prominent for that. Franz Schubert for his time, even though it was very short-lived, but he still did a lot to basically steer point and also kind of pass it over to kind of the Beethoven. And then Beethoven kind of changes the game as we know classical music of today. So in conclusion, we pretty much are just looking at one composer to another composer, being able to transcend not just music, being able to literature, and also just passing down one thing from another, bridging the gap, obviously. And so I'm going to kind of leave it here with that.